Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar with the British Association for Local History, working in partnership with the Historic Towns Trust. My name is Megan, and I am joined tonight by our wonderful presenter, as well as our President, Professor Emerita Caroline Barron. Just as a quick reminder before I pass on to Caroline, if you want to ask questions, we will save these till the end, and you can ask them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen. If you want to have a general chit chat, that is in the chat function. But like I say, our questions will be at the end. I'm now going to hand over to Caroline, who will introduce our wonderful speaker for this evening. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Megan. And it's a delight to be here again for the third of these associations between the British Association of Local History and the Historic Towns Trust. And we have tonight, I'm wearing two hats because I'm president of the British Association of Local History, and I'm a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust, as indeed is John Moore, who's going to give us the talk this evening. And John is, I suppose, perhaps it's a librarian or manuscripts or book, I don't know, guardian of books, librarian in the University of Glasgow for many years. And he retired from that, but his particular interest has always been in cartography. And he's written books on mapping Glasgow and indeed mapping the River Clyde. And the Historic Towns Trust is particularly pleased that John has joined us as a trustee because we lack a Scottish dimension. We haven't actually done any of our Historic Towns Trust maps yet of a Scottish town, but John is putting that right, and we're soon going to have a map of Perth, and we may have other Scottish towns to follow. So it's really grand to have John here tonight to talk to us about, as it were, the Scottish dimension to mapping English towns. And I'm going to hand over to John now. Thank you so much, John, for talking to us this evening.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline. Right, give me a second and I'll just open it up. Can you see that, everybody? Caroline, can you see that?
No, I can still see you.
Oh dear, right. Give me a second.
We'll have another go at the screen share.
Yes, I will do.
Your screen is being possessive and wants to have you to itself.
Yes, and my mouse has decided not to behave. Just give me 1 second. Oh dear.
No problem at all. I'm sure we're all very excited this evening. As like Caroline says, we've not really discussed the Scottish aspect of British urban mapping, have we, Caroline, in previous talks? We've covered Wales.
We've done Wales, we've had Swansea, we've thought about London, now we're thinking about Scotland, and then next one, the final one, we're going to be thinking about Beverley. So we're going all over the British Isles.
Right. Give me a minute, Caroline. I will be with you very soon.
That's okay.
Right, right. It's the Scottish independence movement that's getting a hold of you. That's what it is.
Right, now, I will try again. I'm just trying to think where I should be doing this from. I'm going to click share screen.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that that worked before, so we'll try again. Please bear with me.
Yes, well done.
Yes. Right.
And if we just press play, John,
Yep.
then we'll be able to go full screen.
Right, there we are, right. Right, give me a second. Oh dear. You can see that being a librarian, my technical skills are somewhat limited. I'm having to go backwards, so please bear with me, everybody, and should be with you. Normal service will be resumed as soon as possible, as they say. Right, there, we're okay. Can you see that now?
We can indeed.
Great, right. Well, thank you very much for your patience, Caroline and Megan, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you for joining me in what I hope you will soon appreciate is a talk a little less parochial than may appear from the title. I'm very grateful to the British Association for Local History for allowing me the opportunity to share with you tonight some of my thoughts and interpretation of certain aspects of British town mapping. This will not be an evening entirely dedicated to the cartography of urban areas north of the border, but I think it a valuable corrective to take a slightly wider view of the subject to shed what may be seen as a different light. Tonight's title was chosen specifically, and by the end of the evening, I hope that you will understand more of where I'm coming from in looking at maps and towns. During a rather part-time career as a researcher, I've grown increasingly fascinated by how British towns and cities have been mapped, and the rather fragmented and frequently inconvenient record which has survived. Tonight, I want to focus on three specific episodes in the history of the subject over the last 2 centuries. And given that all three have involved, to a greater or lesser extent, something of a national approach, I may drift into the occasional Scottish reference to, as geography teachers of old would encourage, compare and contrast differing approaches. And I must also apologise if, like Caesar's Gaul, the three parts of this division are somewhat unequal. I want to start by looking at the work of John Wood, an Edinburgh-based 19th century cartographer whose plans of Scottish towns date from 1818 to 44. Although described as an undervalued cartographer, he stands out as being seen undoubtedly as the most prolific urban cartographer working in Scotland in the early decades of the 1800s. His Scottish work is relatively well known, and most of his plans for Scotland are available on the National Library of Scotland Maps website, which I can strongly recommend to you, although the coverage does tend to bias towards locations north of the border. It is now assumed that Wood moved to Scotland in 1811 after training in Yorkshire. But in contrast to his considerable output, we know relatively little about him as a surveyor, despite his plans being described as some of the most impressive maps of British towns. This map identifies the various towns throughout Britain that he is known to have mapped. And while not maybe immediately apparent, the number of his English and Welsh plans is considerably greater than those in Scotland, although, as you can see, more markedly concentrated in certain areas. Wood married in the same year he came north, and it seems most likely that his wife had considerable financial reserves, since 2 years later they bought a substantial property in the exclusive Edinburgh suburb of Morningside. His first town plans, Ayr and Dumbarton, and this is one of Ayr, appeared in 1818. And for the next 26 years, he mapped a further 55 Scottish boroughs. Without doubt, many of these were the first detailed printed maps of these towns. But the somewhat adulatory acceptance of his predominant position has often tended to hinder a more critical consideration of his work, particularly overlooking his reliance on the work of others in several instances. Among these were Aberdeen, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Duns and Leith, where Wood did acknowledge his dependence on earlier work. However, further study has shown that some of his plans, described as from actual survey, disguise the likelihood that they were based on the work of other men. This appears to be the case with Wood's plan of Perth, and also his plans of Bunt Island and Greenock. And you can see here the example of the centre of Perth. The map on the plan on the left is from one by Robert Reid, which was a council commission of 1809. And you can see Wood's depiction on the right as 1823. Some people will say, well, you know, it's a similar area. But what's very significant about these two plans is that Wood normally included proprietors' names, but in this case, he did not. And he seems to have followed Reid's plan in the doing of it. And this raises questions about the originality of his work elsewhere. and the possibility that he may have drawn on earlier depictions which are no longer extant. This is particularly relevant given his considerable output within a relatively short time period. While local historians may be familiar with his work, surviving evidence adds strength to the argument that both north and south of the border, several resident local surveyors were capable of executing equally valuable town plans. As you will have noticed, my title image was a map of the city of Dundee, published by Wood in 1821. And this has been chosen specifically because it encapsulates everything which is good about Wood's work, but also opens up questions about his surveying methods. In an early attempt to elicit patronage, he approached Dundee's provost with his intention of mapping the borough in February of that year, 1821, supporting this with a specimen of his Kilmarnock plan as evidence of his abilities. There's no surviving record of any financial support from the magistrates for this venture, but Wood's plan of that year shows him at his best in delineating features of what he described as a large and well-built town consisting of 4 principal streets. As elsewhere, the naming of individual properties and of their owners provides an invaluable record of a borough regaining its important position in the Scottish economy. However, it's also true that Wood replicates the same images of 2 Dundee churches, as you can see on the pan, which figured originally in William Crawford's plan of 1777. And his table of references, which you can see at bottom right, is an exact match of his predecessor's list of closes. When Dundee archives fully open, I believe that further research may show Wood's unacknowledged reliance on that earlier work. Surprisingly, this depiction of Dundee is missing from the collection of Scottish plans, usually referred to as a town atlas, which was to accompany his descriptive account of the principal towns of Scotland, published 7 years later. And this is the title page you can see on the left of that. Although several libraries hold bound collections of his plans, these appear to be unique but divergent sets of individual sheets without any title page. Furthermore, the descriptive account does not describe all boroughs Wood had surveyed by this date. In fact, 5 towns, including Alloa, Burntisland and Galashiels, which were mapped between 1824 and 1826, were omitted. To add to the confusion, the plan of Dundee, included in all known copies of the composite atlas, is this rather inferior lithograph at the top of the page, which you can see, prepared in 1827 by Walter Ballantyne. And it seems a poor substitute for the earlier image. Ballantyne may have created this version to fit a reduced atlas page size, but this seems a weak argument in defense of such a shoddy replacement. Ballantyne was also responsible for this equally poor lithograph of Paisley at the bottom of my slide, similarly included in the composite atlases. This edition may reflect a rather feeble attempt to cobble together the atlas, and probably was included because this superior and meticulously detailed plan of the borough of Paisley was published by James Knox in 1822. It is significant that Wood did not put his name to either lithograph. My final comment on Wood's Scottish work is to draw attention to the signal omission of plans of both the sizable market town of Falkirk and the fishing port of Peterhead in his corpus of work. Both had considerably larger populations than either Duns or Melrose, both of which Wood had mapped. But in the case of Peterhead, Scotland's leading cartographer of the day, John Ainslie, had produced this excellent plan in 1805. And it is clear that quality urban mapping was not the sole preserve of one man. The descriptive account subscription list amounts to a mere 51 names. And although Wood's plans could be bought from booksellers in Edinburgh or locally, or directly from the man himself, Only 2 Scottish advertisements promoting their sale have been traced. Excuse me. This may reflect a rather half-hearted approach to marketing, but also suggests that he failed to reach a sufficiently wide market to raise the necessary financial support, thereby thwarting the eventual publication of his proposed atlas. It would be tempting to surmise that the failure of this project was the spur to Wood turning his attention increasingly to the mapping of towns south of the border, but the evidence suggests a more complex reality. Even before Wood approached the Dundee Council, he'd advertised his plan of Carlisle in the local press, and the resultant plan appeared in the same year as his Dundee map. Is it possible that this early diversion south of the border indicates a certain lack of focus in working towards a clear objective? Or does it reflect an early realization of the problems of finding sufficient patronage and funding from the outset? In 1843, he advertised himself as the permanent director of the Scottish Land Surveyors Society, but there is no mention of him in this post in any of the local almanacs. So, was Wood a bit of a chancer, or at best a self-promoter? And yet he did not lavish large sums advertising his plans. In contrast to most of his contemporaries, he moved around the country. Did his not being local create a sense of resentment against his work by resident surveyors and proprietors? Although extensive, his choice of English locations tends to be of small and medium-sized towns. Did he specifically avoid places which already had reasonable coverage, or where there was likely to be considerable competition? And yet we know he resorted to using other surveyors' work without always acknowledging this. If this was true for Scotland, how much was it the case in England and Wales? This is particularly important because, particularly important for urban research, since it would appear that unlike his Scottish work, relatively few copies of his individual town plans south of the border were ever published. Research 10 years ago identified 76 English and 16 Welsh plans attributed to Wood. And since then, 3 more, Bridlington, Bewdley and Burton-on-Trent, have come to light. What is surprising is that 16 of these southern plans are not recorded in Roger Kane and Richard Oliver's online catalogue of British town maps, which again is a barrier to understanding the complete corpus of his work. There may well be others still to discover. Now, I've focused on Wood's Scots work to underline some of the enigmas that may be replicated elsewhere. We all tend to an interpretation of the past which is flawed by our own personal fallibilities and bias. And this interpretation can be subjective and based on partial evidence. And as I get older, this partial evidence attempting to make a sense of a complex past by oversimplification is not enhanced by the apparent ease of access to material. This example of Wood's plan of Kelly is held in the Gwynedd Archives at Carnarvon, and of the 16 plans covering the Principality, only 5 originals are held in the National Library of Wales. Of the others, 3 are held in the Post Office Museum Archive and 1 in the National Archives at Kew. I don't think I need to tell this audience that the researcher needs to dig deep to discover something nearer the truth. And as I say, this is not helped by the apparent ease of access to material on the internet, nor the frequent reliance on surrogate reproduction copies. Certain plans of English boroughs appear to be unique copies, as is the case with this depiction of Wellington in Shropshire. Further south, this example of Wood's 1842 plan of Brixham underlines one of the major problems faced by all students of local history in an age of increased access, but limited financial resources. It is held in the Brixham Heritage Museum, and the need for some conservation work, or at least tender loving care, is all too obvious. My final Wood example is this lithograph of his plan of Newton Abbot, produced in 1843, towards the end of his career. And this was printed by James Turner, and it identifies one of the unusual aspects of all his southern work, namely his almost constant reliance on Edinburgh engravers and lithographers for the production of his plans. Not only would this delay their publication, but it may also have alienated local printers and publishers. If the dates of his southern plans are considered, there's a noticeable pattern of peripatetic expeditions to different parts of the country. Between 1820 and 1822, Wood produced plans of Durham, Carlisle and Berwick, but returned to the northeast to survey a further 10 town plans between 1826 and 27. 6 plans of Cumbrian boroughs were produced in 1831 to 32, and an extended trip to the southwest resulted in 14 plans dated between 1841 and 43. Was the avoidance of mapping locations in Lancashire, South Yorkshire, and much of the southeast a deliberate decision on his part, on his to-do list, or what? Given some of these caveats, Wood's work certainly deserves further study, particularly given the claim that many plans are the first printed cartographic records of the form and function of these towns. For example, is the 1847 plan of Grantham the work of Wood, or a local surveyor of the same name? Very little has been written on his English mapping, and I suspect that this is largely because the plans are scarce, disparately located, and difficult to trace. This should not deter anyone from investigation at the local level. Of even greater importance is the potential that these plans have as a base for the future work of the Historic Towns Trust. Wood was an individual working very much on his own, and yet the number of his plans he produced stands in stark contrast to similar enterprises. Unlike my other 2 examples of British mapping, he varied the scale of his plans to suit the individual location. And again, this has a relevance in comparison with the work of the Historic Towns Trust. My second chapter in this potted history is a more corporate, but surprisingly equally little known series of town maps produced at a uniform scale of 6 inches to the mile by the Ordnance Survey. There's been remarkably little written about these, and they seem to reflect a rather ambivalent attitude by the survey to the production of such plans. Many local historians will be well aware of the Ordnance Survey town plans produced between 1855 and 1895, mostly at the scale of 1 to 500, which covered urban areas with a population greater than 4,000. While these provide an unparalleled record of the structure of Victorian towns, the sheets can be terribly cumbersome, they're not easily accessible, and being based on the individual county meridian baselines, not always ideal for those investigating townscape. Those of us who are a little longer in the tooth may be familiar with the difficulties in trying to match up the individual sheets of a particular area and discovering that there was not always a clear continuance of information across the sheet lines. And I won't go into the difficulties in the Ordnance Survey numbering of the town plans, because that's an arcane subject in itself. Nonetheless, between 1919 and 1921, the survey did publish a small series of 22 attractively coloured single sheet town maps, folded in wallet-style covers, carrying a full street index, as you can see in this example for York. All were revised to the publication date and provide a valuable record of building development. Unlike the standard 6-inch sheets, contour lines were omitted. But the maps reflect a sea change in survey attitudes and policy, largely reacting to serious commercial competition from such companies as John Bartholomew. In 1911, Colonel Charles Close was appointed Director General of the survey, and he proved to be one of its most effective and popular heads. moving the organisation towards a new approach to mapping and the production of more, more attractive maps. 3 years after his appointment, Close was a member of the Oliver Committee, one of the seemingly endless stream of departmental committees which investigated the work of the survey. In this particular case, reviewing the effect of outside agents on map sales and the availability of small-scale maps to the general public. It realised that there was a considerable demand for town maps, and this was seen as an area in which the survey could provide a competitive alternative. As a result, one recommendation was that the survey should consider the advisability of approaching the principal booksellers of every large town and offering them a map of the town on a suitable scale. Unfortunately, the outbreak of war in August 1914 postponed the implementation of the recommendations. And these towns were in a way a swan song of Close's ideas on OS mapping, since he retired in 1922, and I don't think it a coincidence that there were no other towns covered in a similar style after this date. Unsurprisingly, Southampton, was the home of the Ordnance Survey, was the first town in the series. But when the spread of locations is considered, there seems relatively little logic or rationale behind their choice. For example, no plans of anywhere in Lancashire, the southwest, the border counties, or Wales. And Dundee, to bring the Scottish element in again, it's the sole Scottish representative. And we can only speculate that the selection may reflect either a very proactive attitude by the local bookshops in certain places, or the enthusiastic sales pitch of survey staff working in these boroughs. Although these maps appeared within a relatively short time, some slight changes of style can be identified. The earliest maps, such as Leicester, Wolverhampton, and Kingston upon Hull, are characterised by a lack of colouring of the surrounding countryside. And we can see that actually in the map of Southampton. This was subsequently replaced by a light buff colouring, as can be seen in this 1921 map of Keighley. The plan was also unique in naming the wards of the boroughs. It's interesting that a recent article in Sheetlines, the journal of the Charles Close Society for the Study of Ordnance Survey Mapping, had a short article on the OS 6-inch map of London dating from the same period. And that's got a beautiful Ellis Martin cover to it, but the maps themselves are uncoloured. A further series was issued between 1931 and 1935, but these maps were a rather poor affair, appearing to be straightforward, uncoloured and unrevised issues of standard mapping. They did not have separate indexes and were printed on cheaper paper. And as you can see from the cover, the map details somewhat shine through the cover. This reflects the constrained finances of the interwar Ordnance Survey, and they bear a resemblance to the Special Emergency Edition series, which were produced for air raid precaution purposes immediately prior to the Second World War. They have none of the attractive qualities of their predecessors. In subsequent years of the 20th century, the Ordnance Survey published the occasional town map, such as Ipswich in 1979 and Lancaster and Morecambe in 1987. But in truth, it has never really pursued the idea of providing a comprehensive series of town maps. Like the town plans produced by John Wood, these 1920s maps indicate the contemporary layout and structure of the places surveyed. But they now have a greater value in being historical records from the past, showing a townscape and topography as yet unaltered by the demands of motorised road transport and the urban sprawl of the later 20th century. Equally, like those plans drawn by Wood, these Ordnance Survey maps warrant further study and investigation. Both these series map the contemporary urban environment. I now want to consider the work of the Historic Towns Trust, and its production of maps of the past rather than from the past. And this is the webpage to the Trust. I'm not sure how much members of the audience will know of the Trust's maps, but I don't think it amiss to sketch in some of its history. And of course, being the Trust Secretary, it gives me the opportunity to make what I hope is a reasonable argument for your future interest and possible involvement. I hope my previous comments have set the context for what I now want to discuss. The historical record of urban mapping is fragmented and has been approached in a rather haphazard way by individuals and the National Mapping Agency. The Historic Towns Trust is now more than 50 years old, and in its renewed format seeks to produce maps of representative urban areas across the whole country at a uniform scale to allow comparison for those involved in urban history. At the end of the Second World War, a desire grew up amongst several European countries to work together to record and safeguard their urban heritage. And current events in Eastern Europe have brought back into sharp focus the devastation which war can bring to individual lives and societies in general. And the wholesale destruction of towns and cities has once again become part of conflict. More than 60 years ago, the International Commission for the History of Towns of the Comité International des Sciences Historiques inaugurated the Historic Towns Atlas programme to encourage and coordinate the production of atlases of towns plans at a common scale, accompanied by commentaries and subsidiary maps. The intention was that these would aid the comparative study of European towns as well as their history. Although there's a considerable volume of works on the history of individual settlements, comparison between towns has faced the problem of a lack of plans at comparable scales. Different countries have approached atlas production in different ways, but the overall HTA programme has aimed at consistency to facilitate such comparison. Additionally, all towns so mapped have benefited from a sequence of plans over time, showing the different phases of urban growth. However, this, it's now 2016 map of the distribution of European towns mapped by this programme does emphasise, excuse me, a considerable disparity of coverage throughout the continent, with clearly Germany and Ireland in the forefront of map production. Some of you may have enjoyed last year's series of lectures on maps of the European Historic Towns Atlas, which formed part of the Oxford Seminars in Cartography. These covered work done in Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, and East Central Europe. In all, more than 500 atlases have now been published, and this image gives you an impression of their variety. Established in 1963, the British Atlas of Historic Towns project is part of this wider programme. 6 years later, it published its first volume of historical town maps, covering a range of cities, including Glasgow and Reading. Mapping style has changed over time, as can be seen in this example of Norwich, included in the second atlas published in 1975. 14 years later, a third volume appeared entitled The City of London from Prehistoric Times to circa 1520, which unsurprisingly focused on the one location. These three works were produced under the editorship of Mary Lebel, who had worked previously on volumes of the Victoria County history, supported by Colonel Henry Johns, an experienced cartographer recommended by Oxford University Press to the Trust at its foundation. And from this, the Lovell Johns Company was formed with the sole purpose of preparing maps for the Historic Towns Atlas series. It must be said that 3 atlases in 26 years can hardly be described as a massive publication output. But from the start, there's been a strong focus on producing material combining the highest scholarly standards with clear and precise depictions of urban growth throughout time. When Mary Lebel died in 1993, she left a considerable part of her estate to the Trust. 12 years later, in early 2015, the Trust, now the Historic Towns Trust, became a charitable incorporated organisation, and the administrative structure was reorganised under an executive steering committee. Since then, its work has accelerated sharply with the publication of 4 new reformatted atlases for Windsor and Eton, York, Winchester and Oxford. This is an example from the Atlas of Oxford. These volumes have been expensive publications, and the Trust, being a charitable organisation, is actively working to widen our outreach by cutting our publication costs. In addition, the Trust has also published a sequence of 13 maps of individual settlements. This innovation of separate folded maps on a single sheet provides ready and affordable access to the Trust's work. And much of this change has been the result of the appointment of Giles Darks as the Trust's cartographic editor. While the atlases are accompanied by detailed scholarly text, the individual maps have an introduction and explanatory gazetteer of identified places created by local experts. This is an extract of the gazetteer, as you can see, from Kingston upon Hull. The coverage is increasing, but it is still relatively limited, as can be seen from this distribution map. However, it now includes recent maps of Alnwick and Anmouth, Beverley, which was published early last year, and this month sees the publication of a new Welsh map, namely that of Swansea. And this is our most recent publication and proved to be quite a challenge, for it marks a further step towards our programme, as it is the first bilingual map, as you can see. These are multi-period composite maps, and the focus of each sheet reflects the history of the individual settlements. For example, the map of Windsor covers a period from medieval times to 1800, whereas that of Canterbury depicts features from Roman times to 1907. This also reflects a change in approach to looking at urban areas which developed in the post-industrial revolution period. I think this is particularly important as the Trust is eager to address the imbalance of coverage not only across the whole country, but in terms of typology, whereby industrial, resort and model towns are included. It also seeks to reach a wider, more diverse audience by considering the impact of ethnicity on built-up areas. Within this revitalised programme, projects are already being considered for towns such as Bradford, particularly as it moves towards being UK City of Culture in 2025. Previous cities so recognised are Hull and Coventry, both of which have been mapped by the Trust. If I'm being honest with you, it still concerns me that there are quite sizable swathes of the country where there is no HTT map or atlas, particularly for much of the north and southwest of England. Given the considerable number of sizable boroughs in these parts of the country, it is clear that there is much to be done. But trustees have discussed potential more distant projects, including places such as Brecon and Paisley and Exeter. It is equally important that a degree of care is needed in the timing and selecting of extending the mapping programme. At one time, I was secretary of the Liber Group de Cartographic, which was the European Research Libraries Map Curators Group, and I well remember the sense of frustration which many of my colleagues felt in digitisation projects which continually focused on maps from the great 17th century Blau Atlas, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. Tempting as it may be, I think it's very important for us not to cherry pick what might be described as the usual suspects in deciding which locations to map. Although the Trust is developing a new sense of direction, the bulk of the work on each map or atlas relies on grassroots collaboration with local historical, archaeological and charitable groups. In this way, publications build on the rich content of earlier research done within communities. However, anyone working in local history is only too aware of the problems of finding volunteers or the lack of suitable local bodies to support research. Nonetheless, the Trust is keen to hear from local groups considering being part of this innovative and worthwhile programme. It needs to be emphasised that the fundamental issue recognised in the Trust's case for support is the need for adequate funding. For an atlas to be produced, a local team of experts and enthusiasts has to be assembled and money raised to pay for publication. This is no mean feat in these times of financial constraint, given the cost of an atlas averaged somewhere in the region of £30,000 to produce. Each project has to participate in a substantial fundraising campaign, and the individual sheet maps cost about £15,000 to produce. And for both types of publications, the Trust will provide start-up funding and substantial help and input to support the monies raised locally. Nonetheless, different communities have different resources. So where are we now, and where do we hope to reach? Well, the Trust is clearly a much more dynamic body today in the production of maps and atlases, but it seeks to achieve a representative national coverage that will provide at least one volume of the British Historic Towns Atlas for every historic county or regional authority in Britain by 2050. Trustees are aware that this is a big job and will need a different approach to achieve such a coverage. Each trustee has been given responsibility for a particular part of the country, and it will come as no surprise to you that I have Scotland as my remit. And I want to extend the number of towns mapped there considerably. We've recently appointed a development manager responsible for moving this programme forward and for seeking funding at a national level from corporate and individual donors. However, it is not a case of mere extension of coverage. The Trust is actively working to extend its outreach, a fundamental part of its charitable ethos. While the single sheet maps do reach a wider audience, there's been considerable work with the British Cartographic Society and Canterbury Christ Church University in creating toolkits to enable teachers at Key Stage 2 level to utilise our maps to aid interpretation of local geography. Approaches have been made to EDINA, the United Kingdom's Higher Education Centre for Geospatial Information, to investigate Trust publications being made available digitally to a wider audience. More content is now available on the Trust's recently improved website, and collaboration with other web mapping platforms has seen greater provision of information to such projects as Layers of London and the Coventry Atlas. Greater involvement with our European partners, particularly with Ireland, is already taking place. And there's a potential of mapping towns twinned with places on the continent already mapped that may have promotional potential for British towns as well. The HTT now has a proven track record of producing attractive and accessible maps and atlases. These provide a wonderful base for studying urban change over time, and as is displayed on the Trust's website, a community that understands its past is better placed to celebrate its present and shape its future. So, a fragmented pattern of town mapping, but nonetheless fascinating, is the story behind it. I hope this has, if nothing else, encouraged you to look at maps of your own area with renewed interest. And who knows, it may spur you to consider your home patch as being the next in line to be mapped by the Historic Towns Trust. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you so much for a fascinating presentation, John. Caroline, do you want to start the questions?
Well, as a trustee, I feel in awe that John has taught me a lot about, not just about mapping in the past, but about the work of the Trust and some aspects of it that I perhaps hadn't paid enough attention to. And I really like the way, John, that you fitted what the Trust does into the history of mapping in the past, and particularly, of course, John Wood, who seems to be quite an interesting character. I wanted to ask you a question about him, because you showed us that map of the towns that he had mapped, and there were large areas, as you pointed out later, where he seems not to have mapped any towns at all, particularly, I thought, in the he mapped Devon, but not Cornwall and the whole areas of the southeast, which led me to think, is there some connection here with the problem of finance? How did he finance these maps? Did he have patrons in certain areas who encouraged him? I was thinking it's a bit like us. We would like to map the historic lots of towns. We have to go where there is money and people are willing or able to support us. Was that his problem as well?
I think it was. I think most definitely he tried to get patronage. There are letters in the National Records of Scotland, letters to the Duke of Buccleuch and to the Dundas Melville family asking for it. But I think one of the big problems of a town atlas is that most of the time the appeal to a whole community, for example, a town atlas, shall we say, of Scotland, is not really going to appeal to a wide audience. People very interested in having a nice town plan of Paisley or Greenock or somewhere like that. But to pay for an atlas that covers the whole country, given the fact that they only had 51 subscribers in the whole of Scotland, which astounds me given the number of aristocrats and large estates around Scotland, he just seems to have been able to not able to raise sufficient funds for it.
So why?
Sorry, yes.
Why do certain towns in Devon seem to have had John, and then other places there don't seem to be any towns which for which he mapped? I mean, is it that the communities in Devon were more interested in their towns? How do you explain the differences?
Well, I'm interested that he clearly went on trips and stayed in a particular area and went around. Now, please excuse me for saying this, but he seems to have taken money from his wife, but he doesn't seem to have spent very much time with her because he's gone off on all these various expeditions, sometimes for a couple of years at a time.
Maybe she paid him to go away.
It could well be that too.
It could be. Anyway, sorry.
The reference to him approaching Dundee is the only, the Dundee Council is the only reference I've found in Scotland so far to him actually getting in touch with people to find money, to sponsor him. One of the problems, and I think it would be true throughout the country, is there were other men who could produce good maps.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of competition. That lovely map of Paisley, for example, done by James Knox, he really steered clear of producing one from Paisley for two reasons. Knox was a very nearby neighbour of his. Knox lived in Tipperlin, which is pretty close to where Morningside is, and they would know each other because they mixed in this land surveyor society. And Knox was a member of that too. So he steered clear, but what he seems to have done is he's cribbed the information of maps where the person who produced a good map has died.
Oh.
Robert Reid in Perth died before he does his map of Perth. David Reid in Greenock dies and he copies it. Now, it may well be that when he's gone to particular places, there have been too many active men who'd say, don't you come and muddy the waters here.
We must let other people ask questions. I'm sorry.
But there is more to investigate there.
It's definitely food for thought, and I think we should start off by saying there's quite a few comments in the Q&A section saying thank you, very fascinating paper, and things like that. I'll start off with M. Backhurst's question, which is more to do with the Historic Towns Trust work specifically, but also a bit to do with John Wood as well. Do you include the Channel Islands in the Historic Towns Trust, as they noted that John Wood mapped St Peter Port in Guernsey in 1843, but did not do one for St Helier in Jersey? And again, my apologies if I've mispronounced any names as a part of this evening. We haven't really got any
plans at the moment to do the Channel Islands, but it certainly is an area that we should consider. And I would think that the town plan of St. Peter Port, it's a bit of a dog-eared thing. I've got digital copies of it, but it would make a great basis for it. And particularly given its more recent history and things like the Second World War, German place, would be a wonderful example for us. There are many places like that, and I'm very glad that was mentioned, because that's something I can put down on my to-do list next time we have a discussion.
Definitely. And I think Giles has supported you there in the chat, saying that the Channel Islands is within the Historic Towns Trust remit, as is the Isle of Man. So if anyone has an interest in those areas and are thinking of joining it, not to give yourself, Caroline, and yourself, John, more work, but certainly options there. And then Liz has put, you indicated the trust was moving forward into digitisation and online access, and it seems that this is the future. Do you see any move to change emphasis from paper to digital?
I think we will continue to make digital copies, because not everybody is comfortable with looking at maps online and don't have the facilities, but it certainly is the case that they sort of two accesses running in conjunction is pretty important. I remember speaking to Giles about the impact of opening up material digitally, and he'd been at a conference in Northern Ireland, in Londonderry, or Derry, Londonderry, and the people from Ireland who covered Northern Ireland as well have very much strongly made this point, that given digitized access to maps does not affect the sales of the map. In fact, in some ways, it enhances the map. And being an old-fashioned sort of person and a very keen hill walker, having a map in your hand when you're wandering around can be a great guide and asset. And at the moment, while people do use handheld facility, handheld GPS and GIS systems, they don't give you the whole size or the sheer scale of it. So I think we are going down that line, and certainly we will be making our material available digitally. And that's, in fact, I just got a reply today from Edina to say that they want to have a word with me about the Historic Towns Trust material to possibly be loaded on. That there's somewhere where we will be able to promote that and extend that availability.
Wonderful. And I think we can all agree here that having digital copies is wonderful, but also having that paper option is great, like you say, for things like hill walking. And also as historians, it's always nice to look at a historic map as well. Makes me feel very important.
Well, the other thing about digital mapping is, of course, that you can add to it and use, GIS to enhance the mapping for your own purposes, which I think is
definitely. And certainly with the point that you said about the National Library of Scotland, I believe it is, that have the map overlays. I'm a First World War historian, and having some of those overlays are really interesting to see the lay of the land during various battles and things like that.
True. So, I mean, when you see these fly-throughs, for example, it sort of suddenly opens it up to you.
Definitely. And then I think it's Susan who's put this, but S. Moore has put, is it possible that Wood had friends or relations to stay with for the English town maps, and this influenced his work? Do we know much about his wider family at all? I think we're now treading into family history and history overlaps.
not that we know of. There were two papers. People who are interested in Wood, there are two papers which were written in the Cartographic Journal about, I think it was 2014, by Brian Robson, who was a retired professor at Manchester. Sadly, Brian has now died, but they are, at the time, they were the major works on Wood, particularly south of the border. And he seems to have taken lodgings more than stayed with friends or family. But there is more detail of that in these two papers, as I say, by Brian Robson.
We'll definitely have to look those up after this fascinating talk. And then Giles has said that it looks like Wood at his peak was producing maps at the rate of about 1 a month, which, first of all, amazing that he did that mathematics over the course of the presentation. And it's astonishingly quick. So he wonders if it suggests that he had a team assisting him, perhaps, or it suggests that he was relying also on those previously published maps.
I think, well, I can speak this way because I'm the son of a Yorkshireman. I think Wood maybe was imbued with certain traits of, shall we say, knowing the value of money. I would have thought if he was wanting to do a big project, he would have lashed out money on newspaper adverts, because that was a great way in which you could promote any potential map publication. And as I say, the whole of Scotland, there's only 2. I get the feeling that he did it very much on his own, largely because he was moving into areas where he wasn't known. And if he was staying in an area, he was probably counting the pennies on it. That's my own interpretation of it. I also think, and it's the other side of it, that, as you say, the rate of him doing doing these maps was so high that I can't see him having done such detailed surveying without reliance on earlier material. And there are certainly examples. I mean, in Scotland, we have several examples of town maps we can no longer find. And one of the things which, as I get older, gives me great comfort is that some of the older research that's been done is actually quite relevant at this point. So, for example, there's meant to be a map of Stonehaven done in 1818 by somebody called Dawson, which we cannot find now. Map of Kirriemuir, which a local Office of Solicitors managed to lose. And I think this is the case. And I think that the whole picture of mapping towns is a lot more complex and a lot more interesting because there were local people working. Now, it could be that Wood grabbed these, and given the fact that there might have only been 1 copy of them, used it and threw away the original copy. It means that we don't know. But there's not much evidence to prove one way or the other. And the jury is really a wee bit out on that. But I think given his track record on, particularly in Scotland, where he hasn't even acknowledged that he's cribbed from other people, I think there's a strong likelihood that there were other things around.
It's fascinating. Peter's also said, great talk again. I've been looking to see how he might buy a new series of historic maps. Are they only available via Stamford's? And he's also pleased to learn that the collaboration with EDINA continues.
If we're talking about the historical town maps, yeah, we should be able, and Carolyn will be able to correct me on this, they should be able to purchase them direct from the website now.
No, I don't, Giles, you can't buy them up from the Historic Towns website. You can buy them, I'm afraid, from Amazon or other people's websites, or from, as they all say, good bookshops.
Right.
But I'm afraid we don't sell them direct from our own website. That's correct, isn't it, Giles? I'm sure Giles is there and can...
We'll let Giles type away while we ask the next question.
No, but they're certainly available. And you haven't said they are actually amazingly cheap. They cost
yes,
$9.99 or now $10.99. It's amazing that they are so cheap.
Given the amount of research that's in them, I think it's one of these things that make a very nice stocking filler for people.
Definitely, yeah, especially the bilingual map that you mentioned as well about Swansea as well, the level of work that's gone into translation, and I'm sure will be the same in future with Scots and Gaelic and things like that as well.
Maybe.
Lots of food for thought there. And then Hayden has put, how much work has been done on the problems of using siege maps? Now, this question has interested me because I'm not too far away from Newark this evening. I'm in Nottinghamshire. And so for Newark, they were told that these have been misinterpreted in some instances, which makes them, though valuable, difficult to incorporate perhaps within the corpus of urban mapping. So is that something that we'd look into in terms of work on siege maps?
Well, very much. One of the projects which I'm supporting at the moment is map of Berwick. And the whole idea of Berwick as a frontier border town and the fortifications of it, and the fact that some Scots still think it should be Scottish rather than English, brings into play that kind of thing. The difficulty for siege maps is the lack of them, the lack of a surviving record of them. It's not an area in which I'm particularly strong. I don't know, Carolyn, do you know much about siege maps?
No, except that there are maps of the defences of London that were in the Civil War.
That's right, yes.
But I don't know of any other siege maps, no, of London, but others may know. And it would be interesting, of course, if one could include such fortifications on one of our historic towns, if we did know where there were siege maps. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Lots of fascinating ideas coming through. And just to note about the maps and purchasing, Giles has come through with the maps can be bought from all good bookshops and indeed bad ones. The ISBNs of our publications can easily be found on our website. Unfortunately, we don't sell them directly on the Historic Towns Trust website. And of course, you can get them through online retailers. But back onto the maps that we're talking about here. Robert has asked, was there any evidence of mappers using balloons? And as a follow-up question, do we know when balloons might have first been used for that mapping process?
Sorry, mapping?
Using balloons.
Balloons.
Now that is interesting. There are panoramic views, particularly done by Thomas Sulman in the middle of the Victorian period. There's some very interesting ones. I included one in the book that I did on Glasgow. It's a beautiful map of the city, which, in discussion with people at what was old Glasgow museums, seems to have been based very much on Ordnance Survey mapping. Which I found very interesting, because what they did was they compared the areas which were shown in great detail with what had been covered in the town plans, and where there were gaps in the town plans. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, there were also aerial or balloon maps or panoramas done of, I think it was Oxford, but I'm not sure that there were that many done.
Wow, that's really interesting.
They were published in the Illustrated London News, and I could find out the details for it. If anybody's interested, they get in touch and I can find out more information on that for you.
We've channeled your inner academic librarian again, haven't we, John? And Peter has said, is the idea with, I'm going to call it Adina, so apologies if it's not, to add the town plans to Digimap for use in universities and schools, or is it something for the wider public to access as well?
Right. At the moment, it's to try and widen access to probably schools and universities. One of the difficulties that I faced when I came onto the Board of Trustees was that there's a completely different education emphasis in Scotland to England. And Key Stage 2 is set, not in stone, but it's much more formal in England. In Scotland, it's a wee bit more suggestive. And one of the ways around this, we would have thought, would be to put them online, and then teachers can use them themselves, because then they can use them as is. And particularly if we can get the expertise from the people at Canterbury Christchurch, they can develop mapping packages for teachers, because it does strike me that teachers at the moment got so much on their plates that if you can provide them with a package themselves, it's a much more acceptable way of dealing with the maps and how they can be used within history and geography of the local area.
Definitely. And then just to add in that John Townley, there's lots of Johns this evening, so I thought I'd mention the last name there, has said it's a fascinating talk, and as a resident of non-historic but extensively mapped town of Birmingham, I am suffering from historic map envy, which I'm sure lots of us are doing this evening. And I like that terminology. Perhaps if you're looking for merch, maybe map envy is a thing to put on a t-shirt. And then Hayden has also put that they believe that John Knox did some early panoramas around the 1840s, but whether it was from a balloon is unclear. So also something for people to look into if they're looking at the history of balloons being utilised for mapping and surveying. I can't see any other questions, and I've got the webinar chat open. I am going to talk for about 30 seconds just to make sure no one's missed their opportunity to ask questions to you this evening, John. And I think it's been a fascinating evening, not only to learn about the history of urban mapping across Scotland and the work of John Wood and Ordnance Survey, but also to hear that call to arms, as it were, for the Historic Towns Trust. And I'm sure plenty of us are thinking of ideas of how we can get involved and support, whether that's buying from good and less good bookshops, as Giles has put it, as well as also putting forward ideas of historic towns mapping. I can't see any other questions, so I'm going to bring this to a round off and an end. Thank you so much again, John, for your time this evening. Absolutely fascinating and interesting talk, and lots of round of applause coming through in the chat. And in terms of our next Historic Towns Trust and BALH, British Association for Local History webinar, that is in 2 weeks' time, and that will be our final talk in the series for this year, and we'll be joined by Barbara English, who will be talking about the historic town of Beverley, as Caroline mentioned. So this series has been all across the length and breadth of the British Isles, and we're rounding off in Beverley, and that's going to take place on Thursday the 27th of April at 7 p.m. Thank you so much everyone for your time this evening, and thank you again to both Caroline and John for their time, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.